Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and to today's video where I'm going to be sharing with you a few of the processes and everything behind drawing this otter using coloured pencils. So for this I use my trusty Polychromos coloured pencils as always, and if you want to follow along with the whole thing or give you the materials, line art, all of that jazz, then hop on over to Patreon or to my website where you can subscribe and follow along with this. It's a whole 4.5 hour tutorial in real time for you guys over there. So I've actually used my own reference photo for this one as well, so you can't find it on Pixabay or anything. It's my own photo, so the only place that you're going to be able to get hold of it is either Patreon or my website as well. But first of all, what I did with this guy is started off with the eyes. I've got tons of eye videos on my channel, so I'm not going to go into depth or really kind of touch on the eyes at all here. If you want to learn about eyes and how to render them realistically with coloured pencil, then I'm going to leave a link in the description and as a card on the video for you. I'm mainly going to be talking about the colour choices and the way in which I've rendered the fur for this. So this otter obviously has got really lovely brown fur, and there was quite a few different colour variations because he had some interesting lighting, so I've actually used quite a few pinks, purples, some greys obviously on this guy. And he didn't actually have like wet fur, it was kind of in between, so it was kind of soft looking, kind of wet in places fur. But the main principle that I used for this guy was I put down a base layer following the fur direction, and the base layer what I used was just a warm grey one. I used warm grey one here because he had kind of grey undertones, so even though he's brown I could kind of see, like in the highlighted areas is where you can see this a lot easier, I could see like bits of grey, and as I said, like there were purples popping out and pinks, so I went with grey as a base for the whole area just because it would tie in nicely to those lighter areas. You can see me just kind of adding in this lighter area now as well. So I started off with that grey. I always get asked about what colours to use for base tones as well, and basically what I do is just pick lighter versions of the colour of fur that I'm using or rendering. So I could have also gone in with a kind of ivory tone, that's kind of like a really light brown, or even just going in with like an ochre base, or a brown ochre or something like that would have been really perfect for this, but I went in with the warm grey one anyway. And then what I've done is just worked from that warm grey one being the lightest, as I said, putting that down, shading it down in the direction that the fur, so I kind of get that initial fur direction down. I don't really have to worry about thinking about it as I add further layers. And then I'm just working through my darker pencils, so I'm working through like a warm grey 3, going through and using some burnt ochre, following through with like nougats, burnt umber, all of that kind of thing. And for the highlighted areas, what I've actually done is just gone through with that warm grey one and then used a bit of like a warm grey 3, and then I've actually added in some blues and pinks. So for this I've used some cinnamon and also used some dark indigo. So I have used some like fairly dark tones to add to these white areas, and I've just used a really light pressure on those kind of darker toned pencils. Just use that really light pressure to get a very, very light payoff of the colour onto the paper. And then if I need to like really lighten it, if I've perhaps gone in with a bit too dark or I need to soften it out or anything like that, then I've just used a white pencil to help to soften that out. I've also used some sky blue because if you've got like a really white looking area, adding in blue really makes it look like super white, like a lot more white, which is really weird. So I've added in some sky blue into the whiter areas, so around his mouth, I've added in blues around there, and also some purple. I think I used some red violet for this to add into like those kind of purpley tones. So yeah, just really accenting that white toned fur using some of those odd colours like blues, purples, a little bit of green here and there as well. I'm trying to limit the amount of brown that I'm actually putting through the white because I don't want to muddy it. So with your white fur, if you are using a lot of browns, you can tend to kind of get this really muddy, really kind of, not disgusting, but like it's not pleasant to look at kind of colour for your white fur. So in order to keep that white fur like really nice and crisp and like looking really fresh and everything, adding in like those purples, those blues, and avoiding using any kind of more natural tones is going to help to create your white fur and make it look really, really nice. For the actual fur texture, what I've done is just gone in with shading for my base layers, as I mentioned with that warm grey one, And I think I've just shaded with 1 or 2 layers of the greys or whatever colour I'm putting down, and then I've just gone in with fur strokes and just built up the fur with my darker colours, just keeping the fur strokes really close together on those lighter tones so you get like a really nice covering, and then as you're working to your darker tones, just making sure that I kind of spread those fur strokes out a little bit so you can still see those undertones showing through. The whiskers and little white highlights on this guy, I've actually gone through and used an embossing tool. I'm going to leave a link in the description for one of those. They're in like my material suggestions down below. I've just used an embossing tool, which is basically like a pen or a stylus with a little ball on the end, and I've used that, pushed hard or used a heavy pressure on that onto the paper and just worked in the direction of the whisker or the hair. You can kind of see the whiskers kind of standing out now as I'm drawing around these ones here on the side of the chest cheek area. And it really does create a really nice crisp white line, but you do have to make sure that you push quite hard, because if you don't push hard enough, when you go over with your pencil layers and you're adding in quite a lot of pencil layers, then you can kind of lose that embossed line. So you do need to make sure that you go in and use a very, very heavy pressure in order to get that. So we're kind of moving around the otter here, and you can see that I'm really adding in this kind of transition of white fur into brown, and you can see that I was kind of adding in blues, you can see lots of purples and also a lot of browns through there as well, and that really helps to transition that white fur into the brown. Now the tail here is where I kind of demonstrate where I'm adding in some of those blues to accent like the highlight area. I've actually used a cinnamon base for the brown fur here, so I haven't gone in with that warm grey one, and I think I've done that because there isn't any kind of white areas where I need to add in grey to. So I've gone straight in with that cinnamon, which is a perfect base tone for brown colours. I then gone in and added some sky blue for like little highlights, and then I've gone straight in and used some burnt ochre, I've used some Indian red, and then gone in with my darker browns like the burnt umber and overlapped that with some of the dark indigo and also some of the purple as well. So you can see as well where I'm just making sure that I follow the different fur directions in the tail. So obviously the tail's coming round to the left, and I'm making sure that all of my fur is coming from the body on the right and then bringing the fur strokes to the left. And there are some which are slightly like coming down towards the surface on which the otter is sitting, and I'm just making sure that I'm angling that down as well. That just helps to give the tail a little bit more of a three-dimensional look. And to get that shadow on the underneath, I have actually gone in with that burnt umber and all of those other layers like the burnt ochre and everything, and then I've gone over with dark indigo, and I've actually gone in with a bit of black. So I actually did grab a black pencil for this because I did have some dark areas, and using a black pencil just really helps to get those shadows and hype up that contrast, which is perfect for realism. The feet of this guy were actually one of my favourite parts to do here, and the way in which I tackled this was adding in his little pads first. So for the pads, they're like a nice pinky brown colour, they're really pink where they're really highlighted, and then round the sides they're obviously a lot darker where they've got the other toes and fur kind of overlapping and touching. So for the toes I went in with the cinnamon like I did with the tail, used a bit of a harder pressure on the cinnamon, went in with some Indian red to start the shadowing on the side, and then on the sides I've just used some burnt sienna and some burnt umber and a little bit of dark sepia and black to add the shading around the outer edge, and then made sure that I've kept like the centre of the pad where the light's really hitting it the brightest or the lightest, and then shaded around it, and that's created these really three-dimensional looking toe beans there. I really love these. So you can see me creating this one here. I've started off with that cinnamon, gone in with burnt ochre, shaded around the sides, and made sure that I just keep that middle of the pad the brightest, and then just adding in all of the other shadows, making sure that we get all of that form in. So obviously if you have paws which are coming in at a slight angle, the direction in which the light is hitting it and where the brightest area is going to be is going to change. So on the left foot the paw is facing forward, so the middle of the little pads is going to be the lightest, but the right hand paw is kind of coming in at an angle, so the lightest area of the pad is going to be at more towards the right hand side of his little toe beans there. So I've just made sure that I've mimicked that and not added the lightest part of the pads right in the centre, because otherwise it's going to create a weird illusion where the light direction is coming from. The legs here, it's really important that you get the fur direction correct when you're adding in legs and feet and everything. So Where the right hand paw is kind of situated here, you can see the fur all falling down towards the bottom, and that's kind of going over the bone structure of the leg there, and that's really important to make sure that you get that in, because then it's going to make it look like the paw is kind of curving and coming down. If you was to add the fur coming straight down, it would make the leg look really kind of straight and it wouldn't give it any dimension. So just make sure that when you are drawing limbs or other features that you're not necessarily used to drawing, maybe you usually draw just the face but you decided to tackle like a little bit of the body like I've done here, really make sure that you do pay close attention to the reference photo and the way in which the fur is sitting in relation to how like the limbs and everything are as well, because that's really important and that's going to really help boost the realism by getting those parts in correctly. So another example of that is where I'm adding in the fur on the back here. So obviously on the face you've got some different fur directions. The fur's kind of coming off to the right, it's coming down as you come around the chest. But on the back here, because you've got this focal point of the face and these front legs, and his back is kind of, you can't see the whole of his back, you can just see this little tiny bit of his back portion. Because we can't see the rest and follow that fur direction all the way down, you just have to make sure that you observe the reference photo and observe where the fur is falling and how it's kind of shaping around this particular glimpse of the back that you can see. So you can see mine is kind of curving from the left and kind of curving up ever so slightly, and then as he's more slumped, as we're coming down the bottom, the fur just kind of comes across a little bit more. So you just have to be mindful of how the positioning of the animal, in this case the otter if you're drawing an otter as well, just have to be mindful of how his body is positioned and the way in which the fur would fall round. So that's really, really important to observe. So I've also added in a little bit of rock texture here, but I'm not going to go into detail about that. I just want to touch a little bit more on like the layering process and a few of the colours that I've added in. So I've mentioned that for my base tones for this otter I've used a lot of warm grey 1 where I have some whiter areas and for the brown, but in the tail and a little bit in the legs as well I've used cinnamon as that base. As I mentioned earlier, when you're choosing a colour of fur, you want to make sure that you're choosing your base layers which are the lightest kind of tones of that fur colour that you have chosen to draw. So the cinnamon for brown fur works really, really well. So would like a burnt ochre, as I said, like a brown ochre or something like that as well would be perfect. And then from there you want to choose tones that get slightly darker until you've got like that kind of top colour which matches your fur. So the fur of the otter in this case was kind of like that burnt umber, and that's the kind of last pencil that I used to add in those final fur strokes, along with black and a little bit of dark sepia as well. And then I've gone from the cinnamon or the warm grey 1 to the burnt umber and then chosen some tones in between which can kind of fill in my mid layers. So again, like oranges, a few lighter browns like nougat and all of that kind of thing, going to help to really flesh in that. Also, to add to brown fur, something you really want to make sure you do is add in some oranges and add some purples. So I mentioned that I added in some red violet and those kinds of colours. Adding in oranges and purples together, they're complementary and they work really, really well together. So adding them in a piece are just going to help those tones sing really, really well. So adding in purple to browns or oranges, it just works incredibly well. And if you haven't thought about doing that before, I really recommend that you go and do it, because you will see just how much more alive your fur looks. It just gives it so much more sheen as well. So yeah, those are some of the colour choices and a few tips that I have got for you for drawing this otter. As I said, if you want to draw it in real time along with me, use the reference, all of that kind of stuff, then make sure you hop on over to Patreon. It's a really good time to join Patreon at the moment because obviously it's the beginning of the month, so perfect time to join if you are thinking about doing that. There's a whole bunch of other tutorials that I have on my Patreon channel and my website as well, so I do recommend you go and check it out and see if there's something that you want to draw and learn some techniques and things. But other than that, I really hope that you've enjoyed this video and the tips that I've given you, and hope you can apply it to not just an otter but some of the other wildlife that you may be drawing as well, maybe a brown dog, something like that. But I will catch you in my next video. Bye!